What would you do if the cross you had torn from the church's wall reappeared, dripping wet on your pillow that very same night? This isn't some folklore. This is precisely what transpired in a secluded enclave of the South, where the river's current runs deep, mirroring the profound sorrows that linger in the hearts of its inhabitants. Nestled between the embracing arms of the Mississippi River and the hushed rustling of pine woods lies a small community. It's the kind of place where front porches creak with age, church bells toll faithfully every Sunday, and the river seems to retain memories far more vivid than the people themselves. This town bears the name Willow Creek. Few strangers venture here. It's not a place one passes through on any journey. Most nights, the prevailing sounds are the faint rumble of a distant train, the chirping chorus of crickets, and the steady, murmuring flow of the water. Yet the residents, they haven't forgotten the events of that summer. They recall Ethan Miller. He was the man who'd audibly scoff at the choir's hymns, who'd pointedly turn his back when the priest offered blessings to the congregation. By trade, he was a carpenter, possessing shoulders as sturdy as anchor posts and a gaze as unyielding as unhewn stone. On the docks, it was commonly said that Ethan could mend any vessel, save the one that had capsized within his own heart on the day his mother passed away. To the elder women of the church, he was a cautionary figure. "He drinks as if he's seeking retribution from God, Mrs. Dolores once confided during a Bible study session. To the youngsters, he's a looming shadow you instinctively veer away from." Father Harris, however, saw him as a soul that God had not yet abandoned, though it was evident that Ethan himself had long since forsaken God. You see, Ethan was once a different man. In the days when Margaret Miller, his mother, his steadfast support, the town's quiet paragon of virtue, was alive, Ethan would kneel beside her during Mass, hands clasped, his heart fully open. But cancer spares no one, not even the devout. And when Margaret's earnest pleas went unanswered, a profound fracture occurred within her son, shattering like stained glass struck against hard tile. From that moment forward, Ethan moved as though burdened by invisible shackles. He spent most of his evenings in solitary confinement within his workshop, hammering nails with fierce intensity into wooden hulls, as if by repairing the tangible, he could somehow mend that which was irrevocably broken within him. Yet, with every upward glance, the sight was unavoidable. St. Mary's Church, standing stark white upon the hill, its windows glowing with flickering candlelight, like watchful, silent eyes observing from above. And at the very heart of that altar, mounted upon a simple oak cross, was a carved representation of the Virgin Mary, her arms extended, her gaze cast downward in serene contemplation. For the faithful, she was a source of solace. For Ethan, she was a constant, painful reminder. He never articulated it, but the way he'd stare at that statue, as if she were challenging him to rediscover his faith, as if she were privy to his unspoken questions and his unfulfilled requests. That particular summer was exceptionally hot, the kind of oppressive heat that clings to your skin and brings dormant anger to the surface. And on one specific Saturday night, while the rest of Willow Creek was gathered within St. Mary's, lighting candles and reciting the rosary, Ethan stood alone on the dock, a bottle in his hand, his jaw clenched tightly. Across the water, the church bells chimed, their tones gentle and sacred, and Ethan spat in their direction. "If you possess such power," he growled, his eyes fixed on the distant hill, "then come and find me." While people cautioned against openly challenging the heavens, especially beneath a blood-red moon, Ethan disregarded the warning, and it's plausible that the heavens responded. No one can precisely ascertain what compelled his actions. Some attribute it to the intoxicating effects of whiskey, others to the crushing weight of grief that had never been properly acknowledged. However, by the time the final Hail Mary faded from the chapel's walls, Ethan Miller had forcibly entered St. Mary's Church, and the subsequent events would reverberate through every pew in town, ensuring his name would be whispered by the river for years to come. They say the day Ethan Miller's faith crumbled coincided with the very moment Margaret Miller drew her last breath. It had commenced subtly, as most tragedies do, a persistent cough, bouts of fatigue, minor ailments. The local physician had dismissed them as symptoms of stress. Yet, as months elapsed, her vitality waned, much like the autumn leaves detaching from the trees lining Main Street. By Christmas, the only thing sustaining her was the rosary clutched within her trembling hands. Margaret had been Ethan's entire world, his mother, his sole remaining family, his moral compass. She was the reason he continued to attend Sunday Mass, even after his father had tragically succumbed to alcoholism years prior. She was the one who would hum softly while washing dishes in the kitchen, who whispered prayers over him during his childhood illnesses. She embodied grace, a living, breathing presence in a home otherwise filled with too many vacant spaces. But even the most saintly can fall ill, and this particular saint did not recover. Ethan had witnessed her decline day by day. He remembered the nights she cried out in agony, her knuckles white as she clutched her crucifix, murmuring through tears, "Mother Mary, please, please take this suffering away." Yet, heaven remained unresponsive. He too had pleaded, not with words, but with fists pounding against hospital walls, with sleepless nights spent pacing in desolate parking lots, with a desperate, gnawing hope that his sheer anger might somehow effect a change. It did not. The night she passed, the town observed a vigil at St. Mary's. Candles illuminated every pathway leading to the chapel. The choir's hymns were sung through a veil of tears. Ethan, however, did not attend. Instead, he sat on his back porch, gazing into the darkness, his mother's crucifix held tightly in one hand, a bottle of Jack Daniels in the other. By the following dawn, he had made his decision. If God existed, he had deliberately ignored them. If the Virgin was indeed watching, she had averted her gaze. And so, Ethan too turned away. From that day forward, the church on the hill was merely another structure. The cross on the altar, nothing more than wood and paint. The hymns, mere noise. He didn't erupt in fury. He caused no public spectacle. But a fundamental change occurred within him. The smile he once offered freely to his neighbors vanished. His voice, once resonant and warm, grew tinged with bitterness, its edges sharpened. He began to work longer hours at the docks, hammering nails as if attempting to drive his grief deep into the wood. The men who labored alongside him noted his reticence, that he spoke only when necessary, and usually with a curse. He ceased attending Mass, politely declined all invitations from Father Harris, and even failed to appear for Christmas service, an event he'd participated in since childhood. His mother's accustomed pew, situated in the second row from the front on the far left, remained conspicuously empty week after week. However, Ethan's resentment wasn't directed at the people, nor at the priest or the town. His anger was aimed squarely at heaven. And the most perilous aspect was his firm conviction that he was entirely justified in feeling so. Thus, as the sun dipped below the tree line and the Mississippi whispered its secrets through the night, Ethan sat in solitude by the water's edge, his shoulders hunched, his heart heavy, his demeanor silent. To the outside world, he was simply the man whose spirit had been broken, the one who had once held faith. But within that profound stillness, something was poised to shatter. Saturday night in Willow Creek was marked by an unusual quietude, the kind of stillness that amplified the wind's sound beyond its normal volume and made the distant church bells seem much nearer. It was nearing 8 o'clock when the rosary prayers commenced within St. Mary's. Candlelight spilled through the stained glass windows, resembling golden threads. The pews were occupied, primarily by older women, their fingers tracing rosaries, their soft voices murmuring "Hail Mary" into the fragrant, incense-laden air. Ethan Miller, however, was not among them. Down by the river, concealed within the shadows behind the boat shed, he stood with a bottle clutched in one hand, his gaze fixed on the brightly illuminated white silhouette of the church perched atop the hill. The sky above was clear and cloudless. A half-moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery sheen across the vast expanse of the Mississippi. The river flowed like a dark, breathing entity, its movement slow, silent, and ancient. Ethan's boots crunched upon the gravel as he walked, each step laden with a weight far heavier than mere rage. The bottle was now nearly empty. His knuckles were white, gripping its neck tightly. From his vantage point on the dock, he could observe the small procession entering the chapel, the warm glow of the candles, the elderly women adorned in their Sunday shawls, and that cross. That infernal cross mounted above the altar, simple, wooden, and serenely still, with a hand-carved Virgin Mary at its center. Her head was bowed, her eyes cast downward, as if still anticipating his return, still observing, still judging. He could bear it no longer. What transpired next was swift, yet deliberate. Some claim they saw him that evening, his shoulders set with purpose, his eyes devoid of emotion, striding directly into the chapel as if possessed. Others recounted that the candles flickered momentarily as the doors opened, as if they too sensed an impending disruption. Inside, the prayers faltered. Father Harris looked up from the altar. His expression conveyed not fear, but a profound, quiet sorrow. He had recognized that particular look in Ethan's eyes before, but never this proximity. Ethan remained silent. He proceeded slowly and deliberately down the central aisle. Every wooden step beneath his boots echoed like the muffled thud of a hammer on a coffin lid. The congregation froze. A child instinctively sought refuge behind her mother's skirt. An elderly woman made the sign of the cross. A few individuals gasped audibly, and then Ethan acted. With a guttural groan and a single, powerful motion, he reached upwards, grasped the wooden cross with both hands, and wrenched it from the wall. The sound of nails tearing free from wood ripped through the sanctuary like a clap of thunder. Candles wavered precariously. Someone sobbed softly. He held the cross aloft for a fleeting moment, as if daring it to react, to do anything at all. "If you are real," he growled, his voice thick with alcohol and years of suppressed emotion, "then come and take it." With that declaration, he turned and walked directly out of the chapel. No one pursued him, not even Father Harris. The only sound that followed him was the slow, stunned exhalation of a community too awestruck and fearful to intervene. Descending the stone steps, crossing the deserted plaza, and traversing the dirt path leading to the dock, the river awaited, silent and expansive. He positioned himself at the water's edge, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the cross still firmly clutched in both hands. The moonlight rendered the water's surface shimmering like oil. For a brief instant, he hesitated, just long enough to hear a distant bell toll from the church tower. Then he hurled it. The cross sliced through the air like a sharp blade, spinning once, then twice, before vanishing into the dark, flowing current below. A faint splash, followed by spreading ripples, and then silence. Ethan stood there for a moment, his chest heaving. He spat into the water. "Let her remain submerged," he muttered, "where she belongs." With that, he turned and retreated into the shadows, convinced he had achieved victory. However, the river retains what it receives, and it offers no returns without a purpose. That night, Ethan Miller retired to his bed alone. But he would not awaken that way. Though the river had claimed the cross, the force that had delivered it refused to relinquish its hold. By the time Ethan Miller stumbled back to his modest rented room above Sal's garage, the Mississippi had settled back into its quietude, as if no disturbance had occurred. The moon hung high, casting its cool illumination through the slatted blinds. Within the room, the air was heavy with the scent of exertion, aged wood, and spilled spirits. The ceiling fan clicked with an irregular rhythm, akin to a clock that had lost its sense of time. He tossed his damp shirt onto a chair, kicked off his boots, and collapsed onto the mattress, lying supine. His breath was thick with the heat of the night and the residue of his rage, yet his chest felt lighter than it had in years. He had done it. He had ripped the cross from the altar, cast it into the river, and finally silenced whatever spectral presence had been watching him from the hill, or so he believed. Minutes, perhaps even hours, elapsed. The room blurred, transitioning between wakefulness and shadow. The heat was oppressive. Even with the windows slightly ajar, the air hung heavy, like damp fabric. Somewhere in the distance, the mournful lowing of a freight train could be heard, growing faintly closer, accompanied by the soft, insistent tick of the wall clock. Then, a sensation of wetness brushed against his cheek. It was not a dream. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his heart hammering against his ribs, his fists clenching involuntarily. He sat up abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. The room was still, yet something felt profoundly wrong. There, resting upon his pillow, was the cross. The identical cross, bearing the same carved Virgin, still damp, still weeping droplets. A dark stain had begun to spread across the sheet beneath it, forming a shallow pool that seeped into the fabric like ink. Drops fell with a slow, deliberate cadence. The sound resonated in the silence like a languid heartbeat. Ethan remained frozen. His initial thought was that someone had broken in, that this was a deliberate prank, a staged event. Yet the door remained securely locked, the window shut, and the cross. It wasn't merely present, it felt as though it were waiting. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and uttered a curse under his breath. Perhaps he was intoxicated. Perhaps this was merely a hallucination, the kind brought on when profound grief curdles into utter madness. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. The wood was icily cold. The weight was disturbingly familiar. Too familiar. No, the word escaped his lips, sounding like a plea, a prayer. He pushed himself to his feet and hurled the cross across the room. It collided with the wall with a sharp crack and fell to the floor, bouncing once before coming to rest in silence. He sank back down, burying his face in his hands, attempting to regulate his breathing. "It's just the alcohol," he murmured. "It's nothing." The fan continued its rhythmic ticking overhead. Sweat trickled down his back. Then he looked up again. The cross was back on the pillow, dry this time, but positioned precisely where it had been moments before. Ethan recoiled, knocking over the chair. His breaths became shallow, his chest tightened, and panic surged like an encroaching flood. "No," he whispered again, his voice strained. "No, no, no." He retreated into the far corner of the room, his eyes fixed on the bed, as if it might lash out and bite him. He remained there, crouched in the shadows, until the ticking of the fan gradually slowed, and even the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then it came. A whisper, not from the hallway, not from outside, but from within the room itself, originating from within him. "You are not alone." The voice was soft, feminine, devoid of accusation, simply present, like a mother's comforting touch upon a child's back, like a cherished memory. Ethan sank to his knees, his hands clamped over his head. The whisper repeated, not in volume, but in proximity. "You are not alone." His body convulsed, not from fear, but from something far more terrifying, recognition. He knew that voice. It was the same voice that used to hum lullabies, the one that recounted stories of saints and stars when he was a mere 5 years old. The voice he had believed had perished along with his mother, but now it was here. And the cross was here as well. And for the first time since he had cast it into the Mississippi, Ethan Miller began to question whether it had ever truly left. Ethan Miller was not a man easily perturbed. He had witnessed men disappear beneath the winter tides, never to resurface. He had extracted nails from his own hand without a flinch. He had held his dying mother's frail body as her labored breaths faded into silence. But that night, after the cross had reappeared repeatedly, after the disembodied voice had whispered from the profound stillness of his room, something within him fractured. Not with an explosive sound, but with a quiet surrender. For the first time in more than a decade, Ethan was no longer angry. He was utterly terrified. The cross now lay innocuously in the center of the floor, dry as sun-baked driftwood, emitting a faint luminescence beneath the moonlight that streamed through the blinds. The whispering had ceased, but its echo resonated within his very bones. "You are not alone." The phrase replayed endlessly, like a persistent tide that refused to recede. He attempted to pace, to engage in self-talk. "This is nothing. It's stress. It's the heat. It's grief. Damn it all, I am not losing my mind. I am not." Yet his voice trembled uncontrollably. His hands refused to cease their shaking. At one point, he knelt beside the cross. He touched it tentatively with just 2 fingers, half expecting the wood to burn him. It did not. The wood was now warm to the touch. Not the icy chill from before, not damp, simply warm, as if someone had recently held it. That was the precise moment his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the floor of his cramped room, between a stained mattress and a dilapidated chair, like a man too weary to flee and too proud to cry out. For hours, he remained in that position. At times, he curled into himself like a frightened child. At other times, he lay flat on his back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, as if it might split open and reveal the answers he desperately sought. The fan continued its mechanical ticking above him, mocking his distress with its broken rhythm. The silence pressed in, thick and oppressive, as if it possessed a tangible weight. And it was then that guilt descended. Not the boisterous storm-like variety, but a slow, persistent drip, the familiar kind. Memories, those he had meticulously buried beneath layers of whiskey and dried plaster, resurfaced like spectral figures. His mother's voice calling from the kitchen, the gentle touch of her hand when he'd scraped his knee, the day she placed his first cross around his neck. He recalled ripping it off the night she passed, discarding it into the river as if it held no significance. He remembered the expression on her face as she gazed at the statue of the Virgin when the pain became unbearable, not one of fear, but of profound peace. He had resented her for that. How could she cling to faith after enduring so much? And yet, here he was, a grown man reduced to scattered pieces on the floorboards, with a wooden cross staring back at him, seemingly possessing all the answers and none of the judgment. Outside, the Mississippi continued its ceaseless flow, indifferent and unchanged. But within Ethan, a transformation seemed to be underway, not a shattering, but a melting. The animosity he had meticulously cultivated like protective armor over the years was now thinning, not by his volition, but because it could not withstand the weight of an undeniable presence. This was not a haunting, it was not an act of madness, it was an intrusion of intimacy, and that prospect terrified him far more than any vision of hell could. He pressed his palms against his temples, groaning softly. "Why now?" he whispered. "Why not back then? Why not when she needed you?" No response came. Only the cross, still warm, still present, and then the tears began, hot, reluctant, utterly draining. They started slowly, then intensified, until his chest heaved and his breathing grew ragged, and sobs, the kind that lacked any accompanying words, tore themselves from a place deeper than mere memory. The man who had once hurled defiance at the church, spat upon the altar, and publicly cursed heaven in the middle of the town square was now broken, barefoot, pleading with the silence for reassurance that he was not insane, that he was not damned, that there was still time. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was at that very moment that the true miracle commenced. Not externally, not within the depths of the river, but within the soul of the man who had spent years attempting to outrun his sorrow. Ethan was unaware of it at the time, but this was not his end. It marked the conclusion of his internal conflict, and that is precisely where healing invariably begins. It occurred just before the break of dawn. The atmosphere within the room shifted perceptibly, not a change in temperature, but a sense of fullness, akin to the charged stillness preceding a thunderstorm when the world collectively holds its breath in anticipation. Ethan Miller lay curled upon the wooden floor, his eyes swollen from weeping, his body limp from sheer exhaustion, the cross still resting near his chest, his hand loosely draped over it as a child might cling to the last vestiges of a dream. Outside, the initial whispers of morning light brushed against the horizon. However, the room itself remained bathed in a deep, silvery gray hue. The fan had ceased its mechanical ticking. The wind had fallen silent. Even the ambient sounds from the street, the distant barking of stray dogs, the crunch of tires on gravel, had vanished. Then the light appeared. It did not flicker or burst forth. It seemed to breathe. A soft luminescence bloomed in the far corner of the room, not originating from any light fixture, nor from the moon, but from a singular presence. She was not there. And then she was. Without a sound, without any dramatic fanfare, merely an undeniable presence, complete, silent, and overwhelming. She stood immobile, enveloped in a mantle of soft blue and white, the fabric cascading like water, seemingly unaffected by gravity. Her countenance was beyond the ability of any human tongue to adequately describe. It was not beauty in the conventional sense. It was solace. It was a feeling of returning home. Her eyes held the profound stillness of the ocean depths and the tender warmth of lullabies. And when she looked at Ethan, it was as though she truly saw him. Not the man the town had ostracized, not the man who had turned his back on God, but rather the innocent boy his mother had once cradled beneath a flannel blanket, whispering prayers by the dim glow of a night lamp. Ethan remained motionless. He was unable to stir. Tears welled in his eyes once more, but this time they were not born of pain. This time they stemmed from something that felt akin to being truly seen for the first time in years. The woman, the virgin, took a single step forward. Her feet made no sound upon the floor. She cast no shadow. Yet, with each subtle movement, the room seemed to grow warmer, brighter, like the gentle rays of spring sunlight filtering through a long neglected window pane. When she reached him, she knelt, not hovering above, nor towering over him. She knelt, lowering herself to his level, not as a sovereign addressing a penitent sinner, but as a mother tenderly embracing her child. And then she spoke. "My child, I never truly left you." The words were not uttered loudly. They did not echo, yet they permeated every corner of that room like sacred oil being absorbed into dry wood. Ethan's lip trembled. His breath hitched in his throat. He wished to speak, but found himself utterly voiceless. He simply offered a single, then another, nod before his quiet sobs returned. These were different, the kind that purified. The vision of the Virgin offered a gentle, knowing smile, her lips curving softly. She extended both hands, her touch landing on his cheeks. Her fingers felt substantial, warm and tender, reminiscent of how Margaret Miller used to soothe his tears after childhood nightmares. Instinctively, he leaned into her touch. It wasn't born of belief, but of a nascent understanding already taking root within him. As she withdrew her hands, the luminous aura surrounding her seemed to intensify. Not with harshness, but as if the inner light she possessed could no longer be contained. Ethan, his vision blurred by tears, managed to open his mouth. "Why?" he rasped, his voice raw and fragile. She did not immediately respond. Instead, she placed a hand over his heart. A sharp intake of breath escaped him, not from pain, but from a sudden warmth that radiated through his chest, as if a gentle flame had been ignited within him, meant to thaw rather than consume. "Because even when you stop looking for me," she whispered, "I never cease my pursuit of you." The wooden cross resting against his chest seemed to resonate with her words. Ethan glanced down at it, then back to where she stood, but she was already dissolving, not vanishing, but dispersing like morning mist rising from a river. In her final moments, she met his gaze one last time, a smile gracing her lips, a complex blend of absolution, remembrance, and future assurance. Then she was gone. The room's illumination softened. The sounds of the street outside gradually resumed. The wind returned, and the steady ticking of the fan recommenced. But Ethan remained on the floor, still and breathless, no longer shattered or astray, but finally found. The sun ascended over Willow Creek, its radiance a sight unseen for years. Golden shafts of light cascaded over rooftops, filtered through the boughs of pine trees, and kissed the surface of the Mississippi River, transforming its waters into a shimmering expanse of glass. The entire town seemed to exhale in unison. Birds began to stir within the trees, porch lights extinguished one by one, and a gentle breeze meandered down Main Street, carrying with it the subtle fragrance of river mist mingled with blooming magnolia. Within a narrow upstairs dwelling above Sal's garage, Ethan Miller stood before a fractured mirror, observing a reflection he barely recognized. His eyes retained a trace of redness, and his beard remained unkempt. Yet a profound transformation had occurred. The persistent bitterness that had clung to him for years, akin to the rust that encrusts old tools, had dissipated. In its stead lay a nascent tranquility, not yet complete peace, but its nascent beginning. He reached for a clean shirt, ran his fingers through his hair, and washed his face with cool water from a chipped porcelain sink. Subsequently, he retrieved the wooden cross, now dry and warm to the touch, and held it against his chest. No words were spoken, no solemn vows made, merely a deep breath. Then he departed. The town was already awakening. The backfire of a distant truck echoed near the diner. Mrs. Delaney was tending to her porch plants, while two children raced their bicycles along the sidewalk. Life had returned to Willow Creek as if no disruption had occurred, yet something fundamental had shifted. The change became palpable the moment Ethan turned onto the church road. His posture was upright, his gaze was clear, not narrowed, and he was smiling. It was not an expansive smile, nor an ostentatious one, but it was present, a small, hesitant curve gracing lips that had known no gentleness for a decade. He passed Mr. Carter standing outside the hardware store. The elderly gentleman offered a stiff, uncertain nod. Ethan reciprocated the gesture. There was no underlying tension, no exchange of words, merely a silent acknowledgement of a truce. A few steps further, a child's voice piped up, pointing at him. "Mama, it's that man from the river." The mother hushed her son, but her gaze remained fixed on Ethan. By the time he reached the base of the hill leading to St. Mary's, the church bells began to peal. This was not a summons of alarm, but one of welcome. Within the sanctuary, the morning light already cast a warm glow. Candles adorned the altar, and fresh lilies graced a vase positioned beneath the statue of the Virgin. Father Harris stood near the entrance, engaged in a soft conversation with a parishioner until he noticed Ethan. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to stand still, not from shock, but from a sense of rightness. The priest remained silent, stepping aside to permit Ethan's unhindered entry, free of questioning or ceremony. Ethan proceeded slowly down the central aisle. The aged pews creaked softly under the shifting weight of astonished onlookers. A woman gasped. A whispered prayer was uttered, but Ethan seemed oblivious, or perhaps indifferent. He reached the altar and knelt. There, observed by the entire congregation, he bowed his head and raised the cross aloft with both hands, not in a display of pride or performance, but as an act of return, both of the cross and of himself. Father Harris approached quietly, took the cross into his hands, examined it with the fondness one reserves for an old friend returning home, and then gently placed it back on the altar where it had once resided. "She has already absolved you," the priest murmured softly. "You are merely awaiting the conviction." Ethan looked upward, tears welling in his eyes, yet they refused to fall. It was not an act of defiance, but a testament to the fact that, for the first time in years, he no longer required them to articulate his feelings. He stood and turned, and the congregation remained motionless until, one by one, smiles began to spread across their faces. A woman in the third pew offered him a tissue. An elderly fisherman gave him a firm clap on the back. A young boy presented him with a crayon drawing of the cross, accompanied by the words, "She came back for you," scrawled in red. "And Ethan?" He smiled again, this time with a touch more openness. He took a seat in the last pew, his hands clasped, the mingled scents of incense and river breeze filling the air. And for the first time in a very long time, he remained. The transformation did not occur instantaneously. Indeed, change seldom does. In the weeks following his return to St. Mary's, Ethan Miller did not transform into a preacher, a prophet, or a saint. He became something far more uncommon, a man who served with quiet dedication. Each morning, just after dawn, Ethan could be found sweeping the chapel steps, an act born not of obligation but of genuine desire. He lit candles before Mass, polished the pews, and straightened the hymnals without uttering a sound. When unobserved, he would place wild flowers before the Virgin statue, carefully selected from the riverbank, the very same river into which he had once cast her away. Father Harris never questioned Ethan's altered demeanor. He would simply offer a nod and a quiet smile when their paths intersected, a priest wise enough to allow divine workings to unfold within a man's soul undisturbed. By midday, Ethan would return to the docks. The shipwright, who had once sought solace from grief and anger in whiskey, now employed his hands to mend what others had abandoned. Damaged skiffs, fractured engines, and tangled fishing lines left forgotten. If it floated, or had at any point attempted to, Ethan would restore it. But his impact extended beyond mere repairs. He began to mend people. He assisted Mr. Carter in patching his shed's roof after a spring storm had torn it asunder. He instructed a group of restless teenagers in the art of wood carving, demonstrating how hands capable of destruction could also shape beauty. And on Thursday afternoons, he would ascend the hill to the nursing home, a toolbox in one hand and a pot of soup in the other. The nurses adored him, and the elders placed their trust in him. Even those who had once made the sign of the cross when he passed now waved from their porches. No one could articulate the reason for this shift. They simply observed that the man who had once decried the church bells now smiled upon hearing them. Soon, whispers evolved into narratives. "Did you hear about that night? I heard the cross reappeared on his pillow by itself. No, he saw her, the Virgin, right there in his room." Ethan never confirmed these speculations. He had no need to. When questioned, he would simply shake his head with a half-smile and state, "She didn't return to haunt me. She came back to remind me that I never abandoned her." People began referring to him as the witness from the river, not out of any desire for recognition on his part, but because the town needed such a figure. They yearned for someone to believe in, not a man clad in clerical vestments, nor a voice emanating from the pulpit, but a man who had experienced a profound fall and, against all odds, had risen again. Strangers started arriving at St. Mary's from neighboring towns. Some would simply sit in the rear of the church, weeping quietly. Others approached Father Harris, requesting an audience with the man bearing the cross. Ethan always made time for them, never lecturing, never judging, simply listening. Upon their conclusion, he would press a small wooden cross into their palm and whisper, "She hears you." These small crosses were his own handiwork, each fashioned from driftwood collected along the banks of the Mississippi. The very waters that had once swallowed his fury now yielded grace in the form of splinters and carvings, shaped by a man who no longer fled from his pain but actively worked through it. By the close of summer, the altar cross had been meticulously restored and reinstated in its rightful place, radiating beneath the sanctuary's gentle illumination. Adjacent to it, beneath a modest brass plaque, 3 words were etched in quiet reverence. "She waited here." The congregation expanded, but more significantly, the town's demeanor softened. Disagreements in queues at the grocery store diminished, and more hands were extended to offer assistance. People began to slow their pace, making eye contact once more. This was not solely Ethan's redemption. It was Willow Creek's collective renewal, a testament to the fact that the broken could be made whole, the lost could find their way back, and that at times the most impactful sermons were those lived, not spoken. The narrative of Ethan Miller did not conclude with his personal redemption. Rather, it commenced its journey through hushed conversations, subtle glances, softened hearts, and the curious gazes of a younger generation who, having not witnessed his fall, could readily sense the gravity of his resurgence. One autumnal afternoon, long after the summer throngs had dispersed and the river had deepened to a richer shade of blue, a boy, no older than 14, lingered near the rear of St. Mary's Church. His name was Marcus, the son of a single mother, a youth characterized by restlessness, sharp wit, and a perpetual inclination towards absconding from town. On this particular day, he waited until all others had departed, until the last vestiges of incense had dissipated and the candles flickered low. He then approached the final pew, where Ethan now customarily sat each evening, a rosary in hand, his head bowed but never concealed. The boy hesitated, cleared his throat, and posed the question that had been a persistent murmur in the back of his mind for weeks. "Is it true what they say, that she returned and that you saw her?" Ethan slowly raised his gaze, his eyes imbued with a gentle softness. He did not immediately smile, nor did he rush his response. He simply regarded Marcus with the profound gaze of a man observing his younger self across the expanse of time. "It's not precisely as they recount it," he said quietly. The boy tilted his head. "Then what transpired?" Ethan paused, allowing the silence to settle and breathe. "I did not perceive her with these," he finally stated, tapping his temple. "I perceived her with this," he added, placing a hand over his heart. Marcus shifted, his conviction wavering. "But people said the cross returned on its own." Ethan chuckled softly, devoid of mockery, his voice tinged with recollection. "It did," he affirmed, "but that was not the true miracle." The boy frowned. "What then?" Ethan looked down at the rosary cradled in his calloused hands, then back at Marcus. "The genuine miracle," he articulated slowly, "was that I returned." The statement resonated with a weight exceeding expectation. Marcus lowered his eyes, a silent internal struggle unfolding behind them. He remained quiet for a considerable interval, then finally, almost a whisper, he inquired, "What if I've already squandered everything? What if it's too late for me?" Ethan's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "She knows how to swim." Marcus looked up. "She," he echoed. Ethan nodded. "The one you fear confronting. The one who never ceased her vigil. You can cast your faith into the river 100 times, but she will persistently dive in after it, after you, because that is her nature. She never relinquishes." The boy stared at him with a renewed intensity, as if not merely listening to a story, but discovering himself within its unfolding narrative. "May I sit with you?" Marcus finally asked. Ethan shifted over, patting the space beside him. And so, a man once considered beyond repair sat shoulder to shoulder with a boy, struggling to maintain his own composure. No sermons were delivered. No voices were raised in admonishment, merely the quiet cadence of beads slipping through fingers, a testament to their shared presence. From that day forward, Marcus continued to visit. At times, he assisted Ethan in constructing toy boats for the church fair. On other occasions, he inquired about matters of faith. Yet, at other times, they simply sat in comfortable silence, absorbing the rustling of the wind through the stained glass windows and the distant, enduring hum of the Mississippi. Other children took notice. A few joined their gatherings. Some referred to Ethan as the fellow from the river. Others simply called him Mr. M. Regardless of the moniker they bestowed upon him, one aspect remained constant. They listened. His life did not preach from a pulpit. Rather, it whispered hope from a place they had all inhabited, a place of being lost, angry, and alone. Gradually, faith re-entered Willow Creek, not with the dramatic fanfare of thunder or fire, but through hushed conversations, mended fences, and Saturday mornings devoted to carving crosses from driftwood. Years later, when someone would inquire of Marcus his enduring belief, or why he wore a small, worn wooden cross around his neck, intricately carved and smoothed by time, he would simply gesture towards the pew where their journey together began, and reply, "Because he believed in me, before I even understood how to believe in anything." In the years that followed, no resident of Willow Creek ever forgot the transformation of Ethan Miller. Not because his story made headlines, nor because celestial beings descended from the heavens, but because he underwent a change, and that change endured. And in a world where individuals frequently falter, rebuild themselves, only to falter once more, that very constancy was his miracle. The church bells rang every Sunday as they always had, but now their sound was music to his ears. The same sound he had once reviled now served as a reminder that he was still present, still breathing, still forgiven. The cross, which he had once violently torn from the altar, remained precisely where it belonged, mounted high on the wall of St. Mary's sanctuary. No one ever disturbed it again, but occasionally someone would pause beneath it, trail their fingers along its wooden surface, and softly murmur, "She waited for me too." By this time, Ethan spoke little of his nocturnal vision, not from a desire to conceal it, but because he no longer felt the need to prove its veracity. The luminescence of that experience resided within the very manner in which he knelt, the way he listened, and the quiet gentleness he carried within those hands that had once been so hardened. Visitors came and went from Willow Creek, some seeking employment, others spiritual healing. However, a select few arrived solely because they had heard the tale of the man who had discarded his faith and subsequently awoke to find it patiently awaiting his return, wet, cold, and utterly steadfast. They invariably posed the same inquiry, "Is it true?" And those who had resided there long enough invariably offered the same response. "You don't need to ask. Simply observe him." The town itself underwent a transformation, not abruptly, but steadily and surely. Neighbors forgave outstanding debts, families resumed sharing evening meals together, and people lingered longer in the pews, offering prayers that seemed less like rote obligation and more like genuine hope. Even the river appeared to flow at a more measured pace at times, as if it too had recalled something sacred. And Ethan continued his familiar path to the church, persistently carving small crosses from driftwood, distributing them to all who needed a reminder that mercy invariably finds its way home. In his final years, he was never bestowed the title of saint. Instead, he became known by another designation, the man who generously shared his story, for in the end, that was the most profound miracle. Not that a cross was retrieved from the river, nor even that the Virgin appeared to a broken man in the darkness. It was that a man once consumed by bitterness, silence, and shame chose to dedicate the remainder of his life to the service of that which he had once repudiated. It was that he rebuilt what he had once demolished. It was that he embraced belief not out of compulsion, but through an invitation extended back to him, an invitation he accepted with a resounding yes. Yes to healing, yes to grace, yes to the voice that whispered, "You are not alone." And this is why every child in Willow Creek now knows this story, not from the pages of a book, but from the repository of memory, because someone lived it before their very eyes. Some may classify this as a legend, but if you were to ask those who witnessed it, who observed him meticulously sweeping the steps each morning, lighting candles for strangers, and pressing small crosses into trembling palms, they would tell you that the cross did not return to him. Rather, he returned to the cross. And that, as it turns out, was the genuine miracle all along. If this narrative has touched you or served as a reminder that redemption is always within reach, do not let its impact cease here. Subscribe to Touched by Grace for more accounts of individuals who have been broken, of authentic faith, and of subtle miracles that profoundly alter everything. because sometimes all it takes is a single story to guide someone back home. Click the subscribe button now. Allow grace to infuse your life.